everyone, to Leadership in Quarters podcast, the interview series, where leaders come to share their perspectives on different leadership topics. I'm Josh Selden, and today's guest is Amber Johnson. A little bit about Amber. Dr. Amber Johnson is a Chicago-based leadership consultant and communications expert. Her passion is helping leaders and teams strengthen relationships and work with more meaning and productivity through better questions and communication. Amber is also an author, and you can find her work at Forbes.com, Psychology Today, Smart Brief, and in her free weekly newsletter at Substack. So welcome, Amber.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So today's topic will be about questions and how we have our leadership through questions. And of course, my first question is, I would love to really understand how you first became intrigued by the relationship between questions and leaders and that whole process of how they think of and ask their questions.
Yeah, it started with one single research study I read. And then when I began to understand it, I could go back and see how there were all these breadcrumbs that led me to it, if that makes sense. So the research study was looking at high performing teams. And they did this fascinating thing where they brought the teams into the room and they just had them have their normal staff meeting that we've all been to 1,000 times.
Right.
Very few interesting things happen. And then the researchers coded every single line of text from those meetings. And what they found was that in the teams that were recognized in their organization as being high performers, the folks who got the most stuff done, had the best results, those teams where each individual was asking as many questions as they were advocating or arguing for their own position. And I thought that was fascinating, this idea of asking as many questions as you talk and share your opinion. It's not how we normally operate as Americans. I was so curious by that. And then, of course, the medium performance teams, the mid-range folks, and the low teams had much lower numbers. And in fact, in the lowest performing teams, those folks were making 20 times more statements than questions they were asking. And even though I had never thought about this before, it made immediate intuitive sense to me, because you can think about it. If you're in a meeting where ideas are really being shared, you have to ask real questions to understand why that matters, to get the idea from the perspective of the person who's sharing it, to work out the complications of it. And I could just see how that inquiry would lead you to identify risks, to consider solutions more thoroughly. It would reduce reputational problems potentially. It would help surface the challenges more immediately. And no doubt that would over time lead you to innovation, to better performance, and overall to success. And so I started thinking, like, what do questions do for us as leaders? And then I could piece back through my career, which at that point had been about 15, 20 years, and look at all these places where questions had played such a significant role, where I had a leader who was especially gifted at it. And one of my very first jobs, I had a leader named Mike, and we were in charge of fundraising for a major global organization. He was one of the key leaders in the organization doing that. And whenever we'd sit down with a donor, if we had an hour on the schedule, he would just start in, tell me your life story. And he would begin, and he would take 40 minutes to just hear the story of this individual. And me and my very task-oriented mindset was just losing it at that moment. I was completely like, Mike, we got to cover what they're interested in giving to. We've got to make our sales pitch. We got to figure out how much money they can get to us. Why are you starting with where they went to college? And then I realized that in the last 12 minutes of a meeting, Mike could get more done than I ever would have if I had just started in with my very task-oriented questions. And it was not because he was building a personal connection, that was true, but he was understanding the person, so that by the time we needed to get down to business, he knew what mattered to them. He knew how to frame it in a way that would speak to their deepest values. And that conversation about feelings, about values, about what matters to us was leading us to conclusions. And I could go on showing you the breadcrumbs that have helped me transform my thinking. But now I'm convinced that really good leaders are not the people with the answers. They're the people with the right questions. And that's who I want to be and who I want to help in my career.
That's great to hear. It's so interesting because, like you said, most people don't ask questions and they don't seek to understand. We talk about active listening and making sure that we're really hearing what people are saying. We find so many more times that as we're having a conversation, rather than me actually listening to you and thinking of questions to ask you, I listen to something you say that triggers my next move, and that's all I can think about. I see it so often in both probably the professional world and the personal world. Everywhere,
Yeah.
that's what we do. We trigger because I want to make sure I'm prepared for my time to talk, and I'm not as focused on listening to you and really understanding what you're trying to say.
Yeah, there's a book, Dialogue, by William Isaacs, and he says that Americans don't listen to understand, we listen to reload. And I just think,
Hmm.
oh, that's so true.
It
We do
is.
that. We're just like itching. But my version of this story is, instead of actually getting curious about the person in front of us.
Yeah. And it reminds me of a quote. I worked with somebody named Ryan, and this was his favorite quote. And I had never heard it before. He would say that you were born with two ears and one mouth, use them proportionately.
Yes.
And I was like, genius. That's awesome. And it made me reflect on myself. I'm like, do I really do that? Do I really listen twice as much
Mm-hmm.
as I talk? And it really made me think differently on how I interact with people and how I listen and ask those questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not just listening in silence, but listening with curiosity, which does mean asking more questions.
That's true. I can just sit here and nod and listen and not really take
Mm-hmm.
much from it. It's really being
Mm-hmm.
active in that conversation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, in your experience, how do you see leaders ask those questions, get deeper into the person or the situation through their questions when they're in a high stress
Mm-hmm.
situation? I think of the example you just gave where you and Mike were in a meeting and he's asking all these questions and it's probably a calmer meeting and you have the time and the thought process to really think through everything. But what if you're in a very high stress situation? I feel like that's when people really jump in and start making their statements and try to take control of the room
Mm-hmm.
instead of asking those questions. How do people navigate that type of environment?
That's a great question. And I want to acknowledge there are times where questions aren't the right thing. If you are in a high reliability organization, you're military, you're firefighter, you're airplane pilot, there's a dangerous situation here, those folks have to do all of their training up front so they can execute with muscle memory. And that means they ask their questions in training, but in that moment, they have to respond to what they've been trained to do and what the command is. So, not every situation is perfect for questions, but in the high crisis moments that I, as a leadership consultant or as a professor or as a business person, might experience, there's usually more space for questions than we think. Often our sense of urgency and crisis is driven by our emotions rather than reality. And our
Right.
emotions are often unreliable narrators of our real experience.
Yep.
So we have to just ask ourselves, okay, if I took 3 minutes to have this conversation and make this decision, would it have any measurable impact than if I did it in 10 seconds? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is going to be no. And so one of the things leaders have to do is learn to slow the conversation down. You just have to slow the conversation down. This is true. Anytime emotion is involved, and emotion isn't just tears, it's not just sadness. Emotion is anxiousness, emotion is worry, emotion is frustration. Anytime those things are present, instead of pushing through it, we have to actually slow the process down. And often we'll find that taking 3 more minutes for this conversation gets you to a solution faster and a better quality solution. So be willing to slow the process down, I think, is the first piece of wisdom I would offer to any leader. When you feel your blood pressure raise, it is your gut signal. Take it as your signal to slow down. And then after you have slowed down, ask yourself, is it possible I do not have the full story? How did this look from someone else's perspective? How does it look for all the stakeholders, not just the ones most on my mind? And that's where you can really ask questions. And I think the final thing I would say is crisis is an incredible teacher, but it's only a teacher if we're willing to learn.
Right.
And so we have to create in those crisis moments a chance for our staff to learn, which means a chance for them to put their ideas out there, to ask for their opinions, a chance for us to evaluate ideas together, to look at the pros and cons of it. And those are often done through questions, but only if you slow down long enough to think and engage.
Right. And I feel like a lot of people don't slow down. When you're in the middle
Mm-hmm.
of the crisis, you're trying to go as fast as you can to get through it. But I think people don't realize that. I like the point that you made about you can ask the questions and figure everything out in 10 seconds, or you can do it in 3 minutes. And people don't
Mm-hmm.
realize that you can do it in 10 seconds, but it's probably going to take you longer than 3 minutes anyway, once you really get through
Yeah.
everything else that you need to go do. Or when you rush it, and if you fail, that's usually people's trigger to come back and say, okay, now I'm going to go ask more questions, get other people's opinions and their experience in here
Mm-hmm.
to figure out what else we need to go do. And the lack of investment on the front end forces an investment on the back end, I'd say 9 times out of 10.
Absolutely. You may make the decision in 10 seconds, but have 30 minutes worth of emotional cleanup with your colleagues
Right.
versus just 3 minutes of conversation up front.
Now, in a similar vein, I work in an organization that we have barriers all the time. We try to get something done and something always comes up in our way. How have you seen people effectively use questions to really break down barriers and help
Mm.
with efficiency of teams?
Questions can help us uncover the source of those barriers. Sometimes those barriers are tactical, like time and available resources, but sometimes they're values based. And when we really understand the values based barriers, often we can find compromises a little easier. And I'm not asking people to compromise on their values in an ethical sense. So let me give you an example. Let's say, and this is actually true, I am an exceptionally time driven person. If you tell me the deadline is Friday at 3 o'clock, I will have it done by Friday at 3 o'clock if it kills me. It's just, it doesn't matter if the deadline's sort of artificial, it will be done.
Right.
And I have a colleague who is very driven by excellence. He wants everything to be perfect.
Hmm.
And for him, if it takes till Tuesday, he doesn't care. It'll be better on Tuesday than it would be Friday at 3. And it grates on my nerves to have it be 3:01 and not be able to take my Sharpie to my to-do list and mark it off. That's a values conflict. It's not an ethical difference. It's not a moral compromise for either of us to give a little. But he and I need to get together in the same room and say the deadline is important for a reason. And he needs to say quality is important for a reason. And then we need to agree where we meet in this process. So I think anytime we're feeling those boundaries in organizations, those frustrations and obstacles, the more you can ask, what does this other person, what is motivating them? What is it about their psyche, the way they work, their personality, the pressures their team is uniquely under, the history their team has with my team? How can we unpack all of this and question some of these assumptions? And some of them are even values based, and perhaps find a place of agreement, or at least a little bit more of an ability to work without friction in this process. And that takes questions. You can't do it making assumptions that I know how you work, Josh, or that you know
Right.
how I work, because those assumptions have a tendency to be wrong, as the old saying goes.
So, how do you train yourself to do that?
Mm.
Because I think normally, especially in a professional sense, in general, we're out to make sure that we get our stuff done. We take care of what we
Mm-hmm.
need. And it becomes more difficult, obviously, as you're in a team because now you're relying on somebody else, just like you said. So, you've got somebody like you who's time based and somebody like
Mm-hmm.
your coworker who is quality based. How do you train yourself to ask those questions and to not get caught up in the moment of, I can't believe they're doing this to me. I can't believe they're
Mm-hmm.
impacting what's valuable to me, which is time. How do you do what you said before? How do you train yourself to slow down, to ask those questions, to seek to understand the why, as opposed to just
Mm-hmm.
flying off the handle that you don't have the stuff done at 3:01?
I think it's a process of really learning to listen to your gut and identify those moments where you start to feel friction and then address it early. In the book Crucial Conversations, which is a classic, they teach us to look for CPR, and it's an acronym that stands for content, pattern, and then relationship. So, a content issue that we have, the problem is purely based in the work itself. When it doesn't get addressed over time, becomes a pattern, and patterns are much harder to disrupt. And then, if we don't address the pattern over time, it becomes a relationship problem because it's no longer just about the task, it's about how you and I relate together to get our
Right.
work done. A lot of us aren't especially sensitive in our busy daily lives. And so we really only start to feel the discomfort, the frustration of it when it starts to be in that pattern relationship transition. That's when it starts to really bug us. If we can get really sensitive and really good about having these conversations at the content area, when it first becomes an issue, when we first sense, if we can learn some skills for having those conversations and build our awareness that we recognize it early and have the conversation early and often, then we can save ourselves a ton of hassle. But it does take just raising your gut sensitivity and being willing to have 1,000 small conversations to save yourself the one giant headache conversation that results in damaged relationships or people being let go or whatever it is. Get sensitive really early to the content of it.
Yeah, you find a lot of people are confrontation adverse, that they don't want
Mm.
to have that confrontation. It's uncomfortable, it's not fun, but they let it get away from them. Then everything you just said happens. You have this strain on your relationship with this person, then maybe you avoid working with this person or you try to talk to them as little as possible. It impacts your work because you may need to work with them constantly, but now you don't want to, and it just grows and grows, and then you start making assumptions in your mind of this is how they're going to react if we have this conflict, and they make it so big, as opposed to, like you said, you have these tiny little minor conflicts that you can get right at the front end and fix it and move on and everything's fine. Instead, we just let our minds take over, and maybe it's the other emotions, the anxiety and the stress level, that you're just second guessing everything, and it just becomes much bigger than it needs to be.
Yeah, we start to ascribe emotions or motivations to people that may not be there, and it leads to a series of complications. And the earlier we can become sensitive to it and address it when it really isn't a problem. I like to think of it as if you came back from lunch and you had something green in your teeth, I would just go like this and you would take care of it and we'd both be fine. We'd go on. I wouldn't feel tense to tell you that, and you wouldn't think I was secretly thinking that you have poor dental hygiene. It was just
Right.
something in your teeth, right? How can we have these kind of conversations when it's just something in your teeth level of bothering you instead of rotted tooth decay? The
Right.
metaphor has broken down, but you get the point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a funny example because it has taken me time to be able to do that. I was always
Yeah.
the one who's like, this is such an awkward conversation. I don't want to be the one that tells them they've got something in their teeth, because then what if they get self-conscious and all these other things? And I
Hmm.
finally thought, if I don't, somebody else may, or nobody
Yeah.
else will, and they're just going to walk around with stuff in their teeth all day. And then I feel bad. So it does take a little
Yeah.
bit to get over those kind of things.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So far, we've heard a lot of good examples of why questions are important. Do you have any examples of situations that you've seen or read about that went poorly because people didn't ask questions?
I think I have to speak generally rather than specifically as a parent. Any parent of teenagers has probably experienced a time when they thought, I should ask more questions about that. And this is just a thing you have to learn to do. There's another story I remember to try to bring it back to the workplace. This also comes from a research study. And it was a study of a partnership between just a giant company, a name brand, like the kind of company that we all own several of their products, and a smaller tech company that they were partnering with for that company's technology. And so it was this unique partnership of a very big, a David and Goliath sort of partnership. And in some of the partnerships that were studied, even though one company was clearly the bigger name brand company, they were really encouraging and came at it as equal partners. And they asked a lot of questions of the other company. They allowed them to ask questions back. There was a sense of trust in the information sharing. But in this one particular company that was studied, none of that existed. It was very much a transactional relationship. The big company was very much just trying to strip out the tech from the other smaller firm and apply it. There was no sense of trust, no sense of curiosity, no sense of dialogue, no sense of respect for professionalism, no even just common human chat at the beginning of a call.
Right.
At one point, this big company who's using the tech of the smaller company hits a snag and they can't figure out the technical solution to a problem. They've tried everything. All of their engineers have tried and tested everything they can possibly think of. There is no solution on the table. And the interviewers in the postmortem of this project interview a guy from the smaller company. And he says, I absolutely knew the solution to that problem. I'd seen it before. I had 100% confidence in my ability to answer this question, but nobody asked me and I didn't offer.
Hmm.
And just think about that. Think about millions, maybe even billions of dollars of technical innovation, of patents that were left on the table
Yeah.
because they hadn't taught the leaders of this big company to engage with people like humans, to ask questions, to assume that the good answers could come from anywhere.
Yeah.
They just completely failed in having a human conversation with this person. And so he withheld $1 million answer.
Wow.
And I almost can't even blame him.
You hear that a lot where, even in the professional and personal world, when you're like, you didn't tell me this, and somebody said, you
Mm-hmm.
didn't ask me. And you see it way more often than not. And if you don't ask those questions and you don't invest in the human side, and it's so easy to see people as numbers, and they're not. I feel like we're starting to get more so on that side where people are numbers and they're here for the bottom line and the shareholders, and that's
Mm-hmm.
it. They're not going to be as forthcoming with information if we don't ask and we don't treat them right and we
Mm-hmm.
don't have those human conversations. And you can either learn it now through interacting with you or podcasts like this or anything like that, or you
Yeah.
can learn it the hard way, like your example, where you make $1 million mistake by not asking the right questions.
Yeah, and it's impossible to ask every question. Our meetings would be interminably long if we did that. But I think what happens when you are genuinely curious, you ask of other people, you make space for them to bring ideas forward, you give them credit for the ideas that do emerge, that stand the test of time, then people do feel free to bring their ideas forward. You don't have to ask every question because you've created an environment where they know their voice is welcome and heard.
That is one of my favorite leadership type situations that you build as you build your culture is the psychological safety. You build that
Mm,
trust that you talk about, you build the psychological safety in your organization, and that makes people feel comfortable enough to bring those ideas up and bring those topics up. If people don't feel safe, then they're not, and they're going to just sit in the corner of your meeting and wait for the meeting to be done and then go on with their day.
yeah, and we've all been in that meeting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's usually a Zoom in my life these days.
I've had it many times in person, and I'm like, it's one of those things where I avert my gaze and I hope I don't make eye contact with the person
Hmm.
because I just need the meeting to be over and I don't feel safe with whatever I'm gonna talk through.
Yeah. And what a shame. The mind share that we're leaving on the table in
Right.
meetings because we aren't creating a dialogue.
Exactly. That's why I'm such a big fan of teams. If you have a team, then you need to create an environment where everybody's gonna input because if not, then there's no point in being on a team. If I'm the only one making a
Absolutely.
decision and talking and not listening, then why do I have a team? I can go save money and get rid of 5 people and I'll just run everything, but it won't be effective and it'll probably fail.
Yep. Very quickly. And you're going to wear yourself out too as a
Yeah.
leader because suddenly you have to have all the answers. And then the time that you don't have the answer, you're stuck and you don't have anybody else to turn to. And you feel like the idiot and you may look like the idiot too.
Yes, probably. So you mentioned we're not going to ask all the questions or a million questions
Mhm.
because then the meetings will be way too long, and meetings normally are already way too long as it is. Are there effective and ineffective questions in
Mm.
those situations? Because I think this is going to be an interesting topic that people are going to watch and they're going to go, I got to go up my questions. I'm going to go to my next meeting and I'm going to ask this person 5 questions, this person 5 questions. Then they're going to go and make this meeting long. Is there a good approach here that people can ask effective questions and get to the point of what they're trying to get to without asking a bunch of other questions that I hate to say don't matter, but will slow progress and not bring any benefit to the situation?
I'm a big fan of telling people how to prepare for meetings. So they should have done their reading. And so then you never ask a question that could be answered by the packet, the slide deck that you
Right.
got before the meeting, that could be answered by a Wikipedia page or by checking somebody's calendar. So that's the first thing is do your work in advance so you don't have to ask the obvious questions. And then I think it's also about asking questions that are open and curious. We all know the difference between open and closed questions. Closed questions have a predictable answer yes, no, wrong.
Mm.
And those are great for choice making. Do you want fries with that? Doesn't need to be any more complicated than do you want fries with that? And the answer is yes or no, always yes.
Yes.
But most of the time, we're trying to ask questions that start conversations. And so then you need questions that are open. And especially early in a decision making process, you need wider open questions. It's not a binary, it's a continuum. So, how do we ask a really wide open question that lets us get bigger ideas out on the table? And then I think a underlooked resource, and this is so true not just in workplace meetings, but in our personal lives as well. Don't ask questions that are about facts unless you just really need that fact. Instead, ask questions about feelings, about values, about insights, about the connections between ideas. So you need to ask questions about what's your level of confidence about this idea and then have a conversation about it. You need to say, what are the assumptions we're making that are informing this choice? So anytime you can ask a question that gets under that surface of the why, of the feelings, the values, the motivations, the connections between ideas, the questions and the dialogue are going to be a lot richer. So those are the kind of tips that I would offer. And if you're a junior team member, don't forget to ask questions that reflect your area of expertise. And that may be your functional area of expertise. You're a CPA, and so you're going to ask the tax question,
Right.
but it may also be something that's different. If you are a junior colleague, maybe you're a social media expert, and just by nature of your age and demographic, and the other people in the room may not be considering how this new product will play on a phone. They're only thinking about how it would play on a computer, for example. So don't forget to bring any specific expertise you bring to the room into your questions as well.
It's an interesting way to think about it. Now, as you're having these conversations with people and as you're asking these questions, and I feel like we all get trained, like you said, ask the open questions, don't ask the closed questions. Do you change your approach based on the person or personality that you're talking to? And I say
Mm.
this because I have to laugh as I heard you describe all of that. There are certain people that I work with that if you ask an open question, you will be there for 20 minutes because they will have a
Yes.
20-minute long answer. So,
Hmm.
how do you either close off portions of your open question
Hmm.
or balance both to make sure that you have an effective conversation and you can ask the right questions without losing an hour of your day?
It's a very real question. That is a
Yeah.
very real question. When it's people that report to you or people that you can have a mentoring relationship with, I think that's feedback you have to give to them, first of all. So I don't know that I can fix it with just the question I ask. You have to fix it in the dialogue of the
Right.
relationship. I often teach junior colleagues it's our temptation to ask questions and answer questions that show all of our research and all of our thinking because we want to impress the boss. But the higher you go up in an organization, the more you just want the executive summary. And
Mhm.
so sometimes teaching people how to give answers is almost as important as teaching how to ask questions, teaching them to get to the bottom line and then to say, I'm happy to go into all of the vendors we considered in making this choice. I'm happy to go into the design specs that we thought were most important, but don't give them all that. Give them the bottom line. Teaching people how to answer is just as important as teaching people to ask questions, I think.
I think that's extremely important and something that we don't do enough. It gets to that awkward feeling of they're trying to do the nice thing by giving us the answer to my question. Am I really going to go tell them
Mm-hmm.
that you're not answering me in an effective way? But if you don't, somebody else might, and somebody else may not be as nice about it. I think we have to get over the uncomfortability of our interaction to make sure that we know the end goal in mind and that at the end, it's better for obviously anybody else they interact with and better for the person that you
Mm-hmm.
have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, handling it when it's content before it becomes pattern.
Exactly. This has been great. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
To go back to that research study I shared at the beginning, where they found the high performing teams were asking as many questions as they were advocating for their ideas. Very simple exercise that any leader can do. Just audit your conversation. Stop telling, start asking more. Give yourself an audit. What is my percentage? What is the ratio that I'm having these conversations at? And see if you're happy with it. And then try to change it. Ask a few more questions in every meeting with genuine curiosity and see how it grows your leadership, grows your understanding, and grows your relationship with your colleagues.
I think I'm gonna this coming week do that and see how many questions I ask in our meeting versus how much I talk. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. I'll be honest, I didn't really know what to expect from our conversation today, and I have loved every minute of it. And it really drives home the thought of a lot of times we don't know what problems we're trying to solve.
Mm.
And unless we ask those questions, unless we truly understand where we're trying to go and get the perspective from other people, a lot of times we just spin our wheels. And so questions are extremely important. And as we've gone through this, I think it really cements in what we can do as leaders to make sure we truly understand the situation and truly understand the people and get to the bottom line faster and more effectively and taking the human aspect in as well.
Yeah, and knowing your people along the way. Take it home. It's
Exactly.
useful in your home life too.
Yep, exactly. I want to thank you. Hopefully, the listeners enjoyed everything. I'll make sure I put links to everything for Amber in the description. Definitely, I want to get that weekly newsletter that you write and get a link to that so everybody can see it. And if anybody has any questions, they can email me at leadinquarters@gmail.com. You can catch the YouTube page here at Lead in Quarters on YouTube and the Leadership in Quarters podcast on any of the other podcast sites that you can go to. Amber, again, thank you so much for everything and your time, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate this conversation.
Yeah.